Okay, I'd like to briefly describe, and this is something that we'll go into in more detail during lecture discussion, but the structure and sort of functional organization of the neocortex. Now, neocortex is distinguished from paleocortex or archicortex, older in an evolutionary sense forms of cortex, by pretty much the number of layers and the consistency of its structural organization. Neocortex is a very consistently organized structure, layered structure of cells, particularly in terms of the inputs and outputs that are coming into and leaving from specific layers. So neocortex is a six-layered kind of structure. So at the surface of your brain, this is a chunk here of cortex that's been split. You can see this kind of the gray matter, right? The actual cell bodies that are located, right, along the surface. And they don't go down very far, but if you were to go, take a gyrus, right, on the surface, and you were to start from the outside and start going in, you'll start encountering layers of cells horizontally arrayed, right? You go through layer 1, then 2, then 3 as I keep descending, then 4, then 5, and then 6, and then below that, of course, is the white matter. These are the the myelinated axons that are projecting, from these various areas of cortex to subcortical structures. For example, the basal ganglia, right? For example, or the thalamus. And then you also have white matter that's kind of heading up and making connections in the gray matter. Making synaptic connections with, let's say, dendrites of cells that are located in, the actual cortex. So in the horizontal kind of direction, like going this way. If you're descending vertically, right, you're going to cross 6 horizontal layers of cells, okay? And these cells are organized, again, based largely upon their inputs and outputs. So if we look at this particular diagram, right, this is showing you, this is the surface, right, of the cortex is right here. So here's layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, layer 4, layer 5, layer 6, right? And layer 4, you should note, is the site of synaptic input. This is where the axon terminals are making synaptic connections with the dendrites and cell bodies of the neurons that are located in the cortex in layer 4. And layer 4 is always the input layer, okay? Layer 4 is pretty much where projections come in. Let's take an example. So if we have, our brain, which is going to fall apart here, but if we have our brain, right, and we are talking about visual information, right? Well, visual information is going to arrive, via your retinas out here. It's going to be projected back along your, these are actually optic tracts that we'll talk about a little bit later. We describe cranial nerves, right? And they're going to be sending the information, making synaptic connections with that central set of brain nuclei, right, that where all sensory information must go first, right, for processing before, heading on to the cortex. This is the thalamus, right? And then from the thalamus, there are projections up into primary visual cortex, back here, the caudal region, of the brain. Well, primary visual cortex, the information, primary visual cortex is a layered, has 6 horizontal layers. And the projections from the thalamus that are carrying visual information into primary visual cortex are going to make synaptic connections with cells in layer 4. So layer 4 is where you're going to get that arrival of information. Now, that information that comes in, and is synaptically transmitted to cells in layer 4 is then going to be transmitted up and down vertically across these 6 layers, okay? And we'll see there's a vertical organization of neocortex that's also quite consistent, from location to location. And then some of those cells in the different layers here are going to actually send axons that are going to go elsewhere, in the brain. So this shows you layers 2 and layer 3, right, are sending white matter axons. This is a little misleading, I apologize, because the white matter, of course, does not go above on the surface of the cortex, right? It only is found, below the cortex. So these projections are also leaving the cells that are found in layers 2 and 3 and heading down this way, right? But layers 2 and 3 are the source of, outputs, basically, from, the cortex, right, from the neocortex to other areas of cortex. So if you're gonna, and I suggest, for example, that visual information, right, that comes into primary occipital cortex is then going to make its way, forward in the ventral direction, into the temporal lobe to help, inform your understanding of what you're looking at, right, to help you with object identification. Well, those projections are going to leave, from primary visual cortex out of layers 2 and 3 and head, ventrally and make synaptic connections with, cells in areas of the temporal lobe, right? Of course, when these projections arrive, right, into the neocortex of the temporal lobe here, they're going to make connections, right, synaptic connections with cells in layer 4, right? So layer 4 again is the input layer. Layers 2 and 3 are output to other areas of neocortex. Now, layers 5 and 6, the deepest layers, right, actually are output to non-cortical structures, actually to subcortical structures. So, for example, in primary visual cortex, you've got all these projections, right? All this visual information coming in from the thalamus, right? Heading into primary visual cortex, okay, in the occipital lobe, arriving in layer 4. Well, there's going to be some feedback to the thalamus, right? The thalamus is a subcortical structure, right? So out of layers 5 and 6, these deeper layers of neocortex in primary visual cortex, which has just received this information, right? In layer 4 from thalamus, there will be back projections that'll go, from layers 5 and 6. Axons will extend back and make synaptic connections in the thalamus. And other subcortical targets, obviously, for layers 5 and 6 of neocortex could be basal ganglia, right? Other structures that are sort of subcortical, the amygdala, the nucleus accumbens. These are targets that will be receiving input from neocortex out of layers 5 and 6. Okay, so that's the horizontal organization of the instructional organization of the neocortex. But the neocortex also has this kind of vertical organization. Now, let's look at this overhead here. This is showing you, again, the outer surface of the brain, right? And here we're descending into the cortex, right? So we're going into layers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. This is actually, from a famous paper where they investigated this, kind of structural organization of the neocortex. And they were looking particularly at primary visual cortex, or V1, which is also referred to as striate cortex because it's striped. And the reason it's striped is because it's layer 4. You see it's subdivided into A, B, alpha, beta. It's enormous. It's really thick. And it reflects the fact that we are very visually oriented primates. So we have a great deal of visual information that's coursing back and arriving into the layer 4 of primary visual cortex. So it gets this thicker striped or striate appearance. Okay, but it's still layer 4 is the input layer for this, primary visual cortex, for this area of neocortex. Now, then all this information comes into, to layer 4, and there's a little sharing across, in the horizontal direction here. But then what I want you to notice, all these little, they look like seeds or something. These and these circles, these are all different neuron cell bodies. There are neurons that are in these various layers, right? And the connections that you see, are actually in the vertical direction. They form these vertically oriented columns of interconnected cells. And these are referred to as cortical columns. These are neurons that are connected, that are linked across the 6 layers, right? Again, there's a horizontal organization to neocortex, these 6 layers that are organized by the pattern of inputs and outputs. Layer 4 is the arrival, the input layer. Layers 2 and 3 are output to other areas of neocortex. And layers 5 and 6 are output to subcortical structures. But there is, in addition, a vertical organization. These cells across these columns are linked in these vertical columns, very consistent.